because we do have Spanish interpretation. And so I just want to take a moment to allow our wonderful interpreters to say in Spanish how people can hear in English and Spanish. So please have the floor and let people know how to use the translation. Thank you.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Me llamo Megan, mi cointérprete es Flavia y estamos ofreciendo la interpretación simultánea entre el inglés y el español. My name is Megan, my co-interpreter is Flavia, and we will be providing simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish. Para escuchar la interpretación al español, por favor seleccione el canal para español. Si usa una computadora, haga clic en el globito en la parte inferior de la pantalla de Zoom, donde dice Interpretación, y luego seleccione Español. O si usa la aplicación de Zoom en su teléfono o tableta, haga clic en los 3 puntitos, luego Interpretación de idiomas, luego Español y por último, Finalizado. Y posiblemente van a tener que deslizar ese menú en la parte de abajo hacia la izquierda hasta encontrar los 3 puntitos, luego interpretación, español y finalizado. And if you would like to hear interpreting into English, please make sure to select the channel for English. If you're on a computer, look for the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen that says interpretation and select English. Or if you're on a mobile device using your Zoom app, you'll look for the 3 dots in the menu at the bottom. You may have to swipe that menu left in order to reach the 3 dots. Once you find those 3 dots, click on that and then click on Language Interpretation and then English and then Done. Y si alguien tiene problemas con la función de interpretación, por favor, háganoslo saber en el chat. Les vamos a ayudar. If anyone has trouble with the interpretation function, let us know in the chat and we'll be glad to help you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. And I want to again welcome everyone to the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network Climate Justice Forum. It's taking place now during Climate Week and the UN General Assembly here in New York City. And our team is on the ground here. We've been here for the full week, and it's been quite inspiring and quite challenging all at the same time as we face the climate emergency on the road to COP29 and then on to COP30 in Brazil. So there's a lot of strategy meetings going on, a lot of work being done in different meetings in different sectors. And yes, it's been a very full time here. So we're in the flow of moving through Climate Week here in New York. My name is Osprey Oriole Lake, and I'm the Executive Director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network. And I'm very honored to be here on Lenape land in Manhattan. And as we are opening this gathering, please be welcome to introduce yourself in the chat with your name and where you're from. When we were first going along, we're seeing people from Africa, from the UK, from Australia, from across the United States. So it's beautiful to be here in this global gathering. And one of the reasons that we wanted to do one virtual event while we're in New York is because not everyone's here. We wanted to share some of the outcomes of this week, but also bring a focus to a very specific and important conversation today around the global economy, which is how a lot of the sticky areas of what is going on really need to be addressed. And as the world does prepare for COP29 in Azerbaijan this November, we know that solutions exist that can mitigate the worst impacts of the climate crisis, and that women, feminists, and gender diverse organizers and leaders are, in fact, forefront in leading the way. And this is why WECAN has been hosting the Climate Justice Forum this week to uplift women in all their diversity, community-led solutions, our strategies, policies, and frameworks, because it's so critical that we have these interventions, or business as usual continues, and business as usual, to put it bluntly, is killing our communities and killing the earth. And we really have to now understand even more that it is code red for humanity, and we are drawing a red line to say no more sacrifice people and no more sacrifice zones. This is a time to unite together to build a healthy and just future we know is possible for each other and the earth. Nature has made it crystal clear that we can't buy or negotiate our way out of the multiple crises that we face. So right now, it's critical to radically imagine a world that we know is possible. So that's also why we're having this discussion, is because we need other frameworks. We need other ways of understanding this moment in time and how we've been operating as a society and what we need to be doing that is healthy and equitable. And I say this because as stability in the current system falters, which it is, this is actually a time where new ways of thinking, visioning, and being can have a considerable impact. Even ideas and policies that seemed too radical before can actually take hold right now. Importantly, the pressure and insight, excuse me, of global people's movements are central to pushing forward transformative and bold leadership right now, because we really don't have the politics in place to tackle our multiple interlocking crises. And this is really important, the way that our political structures interact with economy, interact with this extractive economy, interact with industry is essential to how we are going to unwind this critical moment. So we need to draw upon the knowledge and leadership of Indigenous and frontline women leaders, global climate justice advocates, and feminists who are already deeply engaged in solutions. There's many solutions out there, and one of the things we have to address is what's interfering from people doing the work they know to do on the ground. Many things led by women in their local communities are a solution. And so today, this session is dedicated to transforming global economies from extraction to regeneration and a just transition. We are speaking out in the recognition of the sacred interdependence of all life on Earth, and with the knowledge that business as usual, extractive economic models predicated on fossil fuel extraction and deforestation have ushered in an era of planetary destruction. And we're calling on governments and financial institutions now and at COP29 and beyond to steadfastly commit to keep global warming below 1.5 degree guardrail. And that has to happen through policies that prioritize social, racial, and economic justice for all. And very specifically, we have been pushing this week to say that there must be the end of the fossil fuel era. It needs to be a phase out now. And this is something that has been a big fight this week, because there was the Summit of the Future that was held. And in the original meetings that were held about the final outcome document, fossil fuels were not listed. And it was only a push that happened through civil society and governments and different organizations that finally fossil fuels were brought into the discussion and were now part of the final pact. I just mention this because we have so much work to do. We can't let up one moment. It's really, truly going to take all of us working together. Our call to action for gender justice, racial justice, upholding Indigenous rights and rights of nature, calling for a just transition, and immediately keeping fossil fuels in the ground is an ongoing agenda for people and planet. And it's an urgent call for our very survival. So to get in today's session, I want to recognize how vital it is to understand that we are rooted in neoliberal capitalism. The current economic system is set to continue rapidly extracting resources from the earth and drive climate chaos and further exploitation of people and planet. So to truly address the climate crisis, we must address our global economic system. As we continue to see disaster capitalism play out in real time, it's imperative to transform the system and call for a regenerative, rights-based economy that prioritizes communities and nature. And I also want to announce that this week, WECAN is releasing a policy brief called Climate Justice Recommendations for Nationally Determined Contributions, Guidance for a Healthy and Equitable Future for People and Planet. So because it's a policy brief, that's a very wonky long title, and we're going to put the report into the chat. But it's important that we tie in new economic frameworks into the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions. Through the Paris Climate Agreement, countries are required to submit nationally determined contributions, NDCs, which embody each country's efforts to reduce and mitigate national greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the worsening impacts of the climate crisis. And NDCs are submitted every 5 years to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, with the next round of NDCs due in early 2025. So this is coming up very soon. And the upcoming NDCs represent a critical juncture as the targets and objectives set will influence climate action and policy until 2035, marking the last opportunity really to implement transformative actions needed to avoid exceeding the 1.5-degree guardrail and climate catastrophe. So this is a really key moment. I know that's a little bit wonky, but it's also important to look at these mechanisms and what we have in our hands when we're working inside these systems, even though a lot of our work at WECAN is outside of these systems on the ground. It's also important that we have these interventions. So as I say, the report can be found online, and we hope that you will enjoy reading it as an educational and advocacy resource. We also want to bring your attention to a few other reports that will go into the chat from WECAN. One is called Prioritizing Care Work and how that can unlock a just transition for all. So really talking about women's care work that is often unacknowledged and underpaid. And then finally, another report called The Need for Real Zero, Not Net Zero, Shifting from False Solutions to Real Solutions and a Just Transition, because we're often asked to give clarity around why do we call for real zero versus net zero, which is mostly what we hear about. And I won't go into a lot of detail on that, but if you read the report, you can understand the difference between how many false solutions are being pushed forward to keep business as usual, which is not going to move us where we need to go. And what does real solutions look like stopping pollution at the source and these kinds of things. So today's discussion is vital because we simply cannot continue as we are. It's literally killing us and our planet. And the fact is we have economic models and solutions to live well with each other and the earth. And we need to demand new economic frameworks from every sector, from governments to financial institutions to industry. And this discussion is also particularly timely because COP29 this November will have a specific focus on climate finance. And we want to ensure our analysis from our people's movements, from feminists, provide framing for the upcoming negotiations. So thank you all so much for the work that you're doing in the world. I know many of you who have joined us online are doing tremendous work. And also, of course, to our very esteemed panelists, which I would like to now introduce. They're all going to have an opportunity to share their work, and then hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. So I'm going to introduce them in the order that they're speaking and then hand the floor over. We're very, very honored to have all of these presenters with us. We'll first be hearing from Faith Lumonya. She is the Economic Justice and Climate Action Lead from Akina, Mama wa Afrika in Uganda. Then we'll be hearing from Liddy Nakpil from the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development in the Philippines. Then we'll be hearing from Johanna Bernstein. She is a senior policy lead with Earth for All. She's based in Switzerland. Then we'll be hearing from Monique Verdin from the Houma Nation. We're very honored that she is our WECAN Food Sovereignty Program Coordinator in the Gulf South. She's also the director of Land Memory Bank and Seed Exchange here in Turtle Island, the United States. Then we'll be hearing from Monica Chuchul Gwalinga. She is Quechua. She is Deputy Director for Latin America for the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International, based in Ecuador. Then we'll be hearing from Helena Norberg-Hodge, Founder and Director of Local Futures, based in the UK. And last but not least, Zukiswa White, who is the coordinator for the Women and Gender Constituency, who is based in South Africa. So this is an incredible lineup of brilliant leaders, and I'm really excited to hear from all of you. And we will begin by handing the floor to you, Faith. Thank you so much, Faith, for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me as well. So I'm going to speak to us about just transition and economic justice. I work with Akina Mama Afrika, as was already shared, and I work along the intersections of economic justice and climate action because we believe that the climate crisis is really a result of failed economic policies and systems and models. So we are at a time when a certain part of the world, which is the majority, is truly seeking long-term solutions to be able to address a range of crises And we also are at a time where there is the 1% who will do whatever it takes to ensure that they maintain the status quo. Now, within the Global South, and I'll focus a bit more on Africa, we find that this particular region find themselves inserted in a subordinate position within a profoundly unjust global division of power. On one hand, we see that we have continued to be the providers of cheap natural resources, but also a reservoir of cheap labor. And then on the other hand, we are also a market for industrialized economies. And even when you think about the way the just transition process has been structured, we are the source, like I'll be sharing earlier, really the source of so-called critical minerals, while at the same time will ultimately be the market for those minerals. So the just transition, for me, in my opinion, must therefore be a process of redefining and inventing a new development pathway and approach that is aligned with the unique realities of the most marginalized within the world. The economics of the just transition must be carefully calculated, but not just the economics, but most importantly, the social and ecological aspects, especially right now. And I think for me, the reason why I pointed out that the economics is also because we are at a point in time where the era of financial hegemony characterizes the ways in which these processes are being conducted. So like I mentioned, when you think about the critical minerals that are essential for the just transition, 30% of the critical mineral reserves are found in Afrika. Already the process of extracting and processing these mineral resources has led to many surrounding communities, particularly Black and Brown people, and majority of which are women, rural communities, people living with disabilities, the urban poor, being dispossessed of their right to land and therefore food production. They are deprived of access to decent jobs, even though part of the argument for extracting these resources is to provide jobs. And even the jobs that are provided are really jobs that offer very low wages. So the socio-ecological aspects of the just transition must therefore be carefully defined as well. Like I said, for the transition to be just, it must be delinked from neoliberalism. And we all know that neoliberalism adopts the notion that there is no such thing as society and that individuals are rational as they each seek to maximize their self-interest. This notion, unfortunately, undervalues the social reproductive sector and the critical role it plays in cushioning society when different crises occur. So, for example, ignoring and not recognizing women's unpaid care labor and the ecological resources, biodiversity, and the wider ecosystem that contributes towards buttressing the us from and society from further impact by these different crises. It does this through the enduring and systemic erosion of public investment and social protection systems, the exploitation of Black and Brown people, particularly women, like I already said, and through the continued destruction of forests, of wetlands, and other ecological resources without any regulation. So in the wake of this reality, the just transition era, like I already highlighted, offers significant opportunity for us to rethink our development tapestry. And so this is why for me, I think that part of rethinking would require that we are also rethinking the basis for the base on which the current economic system operates, which is neoliberal capitalist models and the market-based false solutions that continue to be promoted, which perpetuates debt colonialism, climate financialization, ecocide, and the vicious cycle of poverty in particularly the global south. Like I have always argued, whereas the concept of just transition as perceived globally, but also particularly in the global north rich countries, is and must be about reducing emissions. When it comes to the global south and particularly Africa, the just transition must entail broadly addressing our development needs, including and recognizing our right to development, our right to land, our right to food sovereignty, our right to decent jobs, and the right for us to be able to access affordable and reliable energy resources, in addition to the right to sustainable ecological systems. But one of the things that we have seen is that more often than not, all these rights are often ignored as the world seeks to meet its unending needs. And so this is why, for me, as part of what I would like to share with us as an economic model, regenerative economic model that must be considered is the model of degrowth. The degrowth model is an essential part of the now, but also for the future. And the degrowth debate globally, but also in the north, particularly in the north, because degrowth needs to happen in the global north. It can and must be linked to debates in marginal and dependent economies. The hegemony of development-oriented pro-growth strategies must be confronted by, for example, the Marxian dependency theory, by fruitfully engaging with the degrowth proposal, which both assumes that a radical transformation of economies and policies is needed to overcome the current global capitalist crisis. And the focus around degrowth is really to challenge some of the new green development initiatives that are being proposed, because they only work to reproduce the growth imperative and the destruction of life sustainability on the broader scale. And indeed, the unbundling of dependent economies is the only path to radical social change. However, when we think about unbundling must cover must not only involve confronting current green development initiatives, but it also requires the elaboration of new goals and new policies, including reimagining the ways in which the transition will happen. These proposals are in line with delinking and degrowth. And it's important that the rethinking process also ties in the fact that we are focusing also on addressing, for example, addressing but also limiting the plan of territories and people who are at the margins of society, putting an end to unequal exchange and super exploitation. And so part of what that means is that we need to also rethink the ways in which trade and trade rules, for example, have been structured and are regulated, because currently that unequal exchange and unequal way of dealing only reinforces exploitation. So as I conclude, I would like to say that in this way, the current dialogue between dependency theory and radical ecological and feminist transitions can be able to strengthen some of the elements that are put forward when it comes to rethinking the entire global economic system including rethinking, for example, GDP, and therefore really centering degrowth, the degrowth model as one of the solutions as we seek to advance or deliver just transition.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Faith, for your important comments and the work that you're doing, and also really highlighting for everyone, that we have to have this economic conversation from a global South and global North perspective, because everyone is not in the same boat, and we need to be very, very careful about that discussion. So thank you for bringing that forward. And also, we're very well aware of, the issues around the transition to renewable energy that you present that are so critical to highlight that part of the just transition is not just moving from an extractive fossil fuel economy to now a renewable energy economy that then is using extraction of transition minerals that destroys the earth and communities just as much as fossil fuels. So the transition isn't just keeping business as usual. It's a much deeper transformative change, as you mentioned, around degrowth or beyond growth, and other models we'll get into. But thank you for highlighting those critical points, because we're talking about systemic change at a deep level, not just, moving line items from one side or to the other on our budgets. So thank you for your comments. And I would now like to bring to the table Johanna Bernstein. You have the floor, Johanna. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Osprey. Can you hear me? I notice I've been having some problems with the connection. So if I freeze out, will you just signal?
Certainly. Right now, we
Yeah.
hear you. We see you fine. Everything looks great. Thank you. I'll let you know.
Great. Thanks, Osprey. So I wanted to start, first of all, by I was asked to talk about our vision for a just transition, and to say a few words about where we're at with the climate finance challenges. And I wanted to start first by framing some of the underlying factors that are impeding the just economic transformation. And this stems from the work that we've done. We've recently applied our Earth for All system dynamics modeling to explore SDG pathways in the sub-Saharan African continent. And the obstacles that I'm going to share with you very briefly are obstacles that are not unique to Africa. And these are the obstacles that are really, truly preventing the continent from investing in the just transition, but from investing in poverty eradication, from investing in empowerment and inequality, and also the food system transformation. So the first obstacle is, of course, financing flows. And we know that the cost to achieve the SDGs by 2030 in Africa are upwards of $1.3 trillion per year. And this figure could easily increase to 19 trillion before the end of the decade. We know that financing flows are nowhere near what the continent needs. And we also know that dwindling finance flows are exacerbated by the debt burden, which has increased about 4 times over the rate of economic growth, reaching a staggering 1.8 trillion in the year 2020. So the debt burden is a massive factor. And again, you look at the final version of the Pact for the Future, and the language that we see in debt is nowhere near the level of ambition that we need to see, because what we know this from the modeling, is that the debt relief imperative threads through every single one of the SDGs. And this is particularly important for public spending, where African countries are facing, as we know, debt servicing costs of 3 times as much as they're spending on education, 6 times on health spending, 22 times on social spending, and a whopping 236 times more than what they are spending on climate adaptation. the third big obstacle is the fact that Africa's growth rates, and I think this is the case for many other countries in other regions, that the growth rates have been steadily decreasing from, in Africa's case, from 4% in 2021 to 3.6% in 2022 and further downward. And our modeling shows that the per capita growth rate will never rise above 2% for the rest of the century. And you know, when you couple this with the debt burden, with the fact that financing flows are going in the wrong direction, these sorts of projections make for a very grim scenario. And what's worse is that the unfair distribution of income, i.e. the worker's share versus the owner's share, remains and will remain unchanged. So another factor that is really going to be a big impediment to the transformative, to the economic transformation and indeed to the just transition. Another factor is broken ODA promises. Now, I've been in this world since 1991. I'm 63, and we have been talking about these same issues since your summit. And broken ODA promises, again, it's the same line. The proportion of ODA going to Africa is 25%. 25% of all of global ODA is going to Africa. This is the lowest that it's been in decades. And we know that dwindling ODA, like the problem with financial flows, like the problem with debt burden, will deprive the continent of the resources needed to make the so-called giant leap and achieve the SDGs. And then another broken promise, and this brings me into climate finance, the climate finance question, is that from 2020 to 2030, the funding that was required for African countries for their climate goals was estimated at 2.8 trillion. And this is a figure that represents more than 93% of Africa's GDP. Now, we know that this is a stark contrast between what Africa needs, i.e. 2.8 trillion, and what it actually is receiving, 30 billion, representing a mere 3% of global finance. Now, the drama gets even worse because what's happening is that over 72% of the climate financing is being dispersed in the form of interest-bearing loans as opposed to concessional financing. And so that the irony is that whilst governments now are applauding themselves for having met their climate financing pledges, the reality, and Reuters did a really interesting investigative reporting last year, is that the majority of this climate financing is going to Africa and indeed into many other regions of the world in the form of debt. And the reality is that the climate financing pledges are actually contributing to the worsening debt burden into the debt burden for African countries. So when we take all of this into account, you know, and realize, well, what do we need in order for countries, let's say in the global south, to achieve the economic transformation? It starts first with the freeing of fiscal space. That is a starting point for us. But the freeing of fiscal space, the responsibility lies with the international community. And it lies in the form of immediate debt cancellation. It lies in the international community hands in terms of reform of the debt architecture, improvement in the allocation. I haven't talked about it, the special drawing rights. It also lies in terms of reining in the predatory lending practices of private banks. You know, as you know, Blackstone, one of the most duplicitous bad actors, you know, holds a pretty phenomenal amount of debt with African countries. And it lies with, you know, the responsibility to honor pledges that were made 30, 40, 50 years ago. And I want to just say, because Oscar, you did refer to the fossil fuel language in the pact. And what's really critical is that we're not really calling, I'm sorry to say, if I may say a swear word, bullshit, right? With the banks. the role that the banks are playing they've invested more than 150 billion into companies, fossil fuel companies whose giant carbon bombs projects will blow the carbon budget. The role of the banks is generating hundreds of billions of dollars in windfall profits, whilst households around the world are experiencing deepening food and energy poverty. We know that in terms of inequality, the role of the duplicitous role of the banks, against the background of the global energy and cost of living crises, BP, Exxon, Chevron, Shell, Total, they posted over $200 billion of profits in 2022. Now, let's remember that these profits have been distributed almost entirely to shareholders in the form of dividends and share buyback schemes, exorbitant pay to CEOs, and at a time when millions, now billions around the world, are living without access to electricity or struggling to heat their homes. And we know that, and this will be my final point here, is that worsening inequality that is being exacerbated. All of the factors that I've just discussed are only going to condemn communities around the world to worsening poverty, which will drive up social tensions, drive down well-being, and destabilizing societies around the world at a time when we're seeing a widespread unraveling of law and order and sowing the seeds of collapse, the backsliding of democracies, and the increase in conflict around the world. So I just wanted to share with you those thoughts in terms of, the factors that we're looking at, the really very concrete obstacles and barriers that are preventing the transformation that we need to see in this decade. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Johanna, for your comments. And just so everyone knows, we're putting links into the chat with materials and references for what the speakers are talking about, so you can follow up that way. I wanted to thank you for sharing a global perspective. This Zoom call was also to look at the very broad picture of what we're looking at in terms of our current economic frameworks, where the disparities are, where there are giant injustices and inequalities, and also look at scale, at the local community level, because there's a lot of different discussions going on. There's what governments are doing, which is very unjust and unfair. And just to call it out, it is the wealthy countries that continue to push business as usual, extract from the global south, and then throw them into debt. So this vicious cycle has got to stop. Mm-hmm. And you referenced it, so I just wanted to put a punctuation point on that. Mm-hmm. And then also to say that we're operating at a very complex level, which is there are solutions at a very localized level where people are just taking back their power, growing their own food, generating their own energy, and developing their own local economy, which is part of the just transition. We need governments to get on board, which is very difficult because those in power don't want it to change. Let's be quite honest. We're asking them to do something they don't want to do. And we have to find the collective power to shut down a lot of the dangerous industries and dangerous economic practices that are in place. And then we also have industry, or since we've been talking about the fossil fuel industry, that is financing a lot of harms. So I want to also mention, and Catherine, if you could put in the chat, a report that we've come out with recently on the gendered and racial impacts of the fossil fuel industry and complicit financial institutions, to name the names of the companies that are causing the harm and the banks that are investing and the asset management firms that are investing, because we can really go after the financial institutions to make this change, because the companies themselves are not going to go belly up on their own. There's going to have to be pressure from all sides. So on the one hand, we need to be building these economies and futures that we want and understanding these new frameworks of beyond growth and degrowth and not just looking at GDP, while we also continue to stop bad actors, because so much harm is going on. And this is our collective work. And I'd like to now hand the floor over to Monique Verdin from the Houma Nation. We're so glad to have you with us, because again, we're all operating at different scales, and everything in this ecosystem is so important. Monique, you have the floor. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, good morning. I'm gonna try to share my screen here. I want to just start by recognizing that there is a huge storm in the Gulf of Mexico that is gaining rapid strength. This is new for us who live along the coastline to get used to seeing a little disturbance in the Caribbean that suddenly blows up, but this is becoming the new norm. So just thinking of all those folks that are in the Big Bend and on the west coast of the peninsula of Florida. I'm here at the end of the Mississippi River in that in-between fresh and saltwater land that is water, land, and land, water. This is some of the newest land on the planet, and it's also disappearing at one of the fastest rates in the world. What took Mother Nature 5,000 to 8,000 years to create, swishing back and forth with this, a lifeline of fresh water that is the Mississippi River, building up this land. It's taken man, less than 100 years to cut many canals for navigation and for extraction and for the plantation mentality of colonial times and control of the river for profit and gain. It takes different shapes. It is, was sugar, is kind of still sugar, and has shifted to the industrial chemical and a petrochemical complex that is along our banks here at the end of the Mississippi. I'm super grateful to be in collaboration with WECAN. In the middle of COVID is when we first imagined what the Oklahina Ikish Holo could be, and have been working towards and seeding ideas and seeding gardens and seeding networks ever since. So thank you to WECAN and for having creating these spaces for these global conversations. So honored to be with all of you wherever you all are. I just want to, just to say that this map here, there's small dots that you might see or not see, but our network is spread between the edge of the Atchafalaya Basin, which is actually the oldest part of the Mississippi River, over by the Bayou Teche, all the way to Florala, Alabama, which is Old Muskogee territory, where one of our collaborators are. Sauvage Jardin, Wild Gardens are two sites that I am tending to in community and collaboration, of course, with the nature and my fellow Oklahina Ikish Holo folks. And I just, the southeastern part of the boot-shaped state that is Louisiana is where I'm from originally, and there's 8 acres that I'm tending to there, which is old family land along the Bayou Terrebonne. And just the other day, I think often it's like the land is between the Toka gas plant and the old Kenilworth plantation. And on this old sugarcane fields where enslaved folks were and where Indigenous people were run out of long ago and have been in hiding and in a process of assimilation ever since the French sailed in to, claim and rename this place. And the other day I saw all of this work happening at the Toka gas plant. And so I just, did a little research and realized that that work is this expansion because of a pipeline that's going to be pushing natural gas to the furthest ends of the Mississippi River. You can see the Bird's Foot down there, and not too far from there is where Venture Global is building this massive liquefied natural gas terminal. So, the things that are all around us, the invisibilized rivers and also the invisibilized pipelines that are here, and what that means on a global scale, that this terminal is one of a number that are under construction, and we have 3 of the 7 already operating liquefied natural gas terminals in the so-called United States here in Turtle Island. And these are huge consequences, and also putting these facilities where we're losing land at one of the fastest rates on the planet does not seem like the smartest thing to do. But our attempt to remain and reclaim, even though all of this is going on, and to recognize that we are in a power point on the planet. And so how can these territories that are closer to where the waters are rising and the land is disappearing can be in relationship with a little bit higher ground, where we have Prairie des Femmes, which is 12 acres of land that we're building out as a site that folks can retreat to in good times and in bad. And we're putting in a fruit forest there. It's an old sweet potato field that is being rematriated and continues to evolve. We've also been stewarding in community with other folks the Nani Bulbuncha, which is kind of a land back in a way in the crescent city of at the end of the river here in so-called New Orleans. Bulbuncha is a Choctaw word which means place of babbling languages, or place of many languages. And I think this place is still living up to that name, even though we call it New Orleans now. It is Bulbuncha. And over the course of this spring, winter to spring, we worked with community, including the Grodat Youth Farm here, and many other allies, to build a mound, a modern Indigenous mound here in the Delta. There are many mounds all across the Mississippi River watershed that are very ancient sites. And we've activated this site as a site of exchange, and building together and learning together, and really trying to hold it as a neutral ground mound that we can return to. And this fall and winter, we'll be seeding the Medicine Wheel Gardens there with collaborators from the Oklahina Ikisholo, and are activating the space, selling Yopon tea and sharing plant knowledge and plants. We just had a plant swap this past Sunday. So looking forward to what grows there. Also further south in the Bayou communities, we've been working with Clarice Molina Freelou. She's a tribal councilwoman with the United Houma Nation, also my dear cousin, who is why I got into this work, because this land where you see the Grand Bois Healing House, Grand Bois means big woods, and it's right next door to what is a open pit waste facility, where they're taking material from offshore, onshore, and treating it. So this site is being activated where we're going to be growing medicine here. It also is a site of distribution and a place that we are solar powering, so that in times, just when Francine happened, just a couple of weeks ago, it came in Terrebonne Parish. And so we were able to show up at the healing house. We set up a solar generator, and we're able to have communications in place. And it became what we dreamed of, which is, on a small scale, because it was not a major storm. We were very lucky this time, but the dream for this is to be a place, again, to gather in good times and in bad, to be a cultural center, a celebration site for the seasons, and also a place where we can all learn and grow together. And speaking of learning and growing, we've been learning and growing in a lot of ways. And you think about farming, and think about, I've been thinking more about autonomy than sovereignty, that we need autonomous and interconnected systems. And so we've been in collaboration with the Footprint Project, learning about solar for these times, knowing that we're up against a lot here on the Gulf Coast, as we all are all over the planet. And also learning about technologies, portable network kits and networking, and thinking about how these kinds of systems, not only can they help us in times of disaster, but again, how can we use these tools, this technology, to help support ecologies? So thinking about monitoring systems, thinking about record keeping, thinking about ways that we share information. And so we've been in collaboration with the Bulbuncha Liberation Radio, helping to support news and views and environmental concerns on the Gulf South, as well as Lady J, who is part of the Oklahina Ikisholo, is always sharing plant knowledge and wisdom with our weekly broadcast, which happens on Tuesdays. And then SwampNet is something that we're dabbling with, and record keeping and knowledge collection, and having off-grid intranet systems. Dr. Tammy Greer, who is our elder and one of our most beautiful collaborators, has really inspired us with this medicine wheel garden that she's stewarding up at the University of Southern Mississippi. And so we think of these sites as both sites of learning and exchange, and of growing medicine and of sharing medicine. And I know I've run out of time, but I think that these kinds of networks and these systems, and leaning into sites that we are planning in multi-generational ways, and thinking about how we can endure the changes that we're up against, and how what we're learning now in these times of change, and what we're looking back to in the traditional knowledges of the land and of our people, can help us to find resilience, to real, true resilience, not just the word, but to be not only resilient, but in relationship, regenerative relationship with each other and the planet that we live. And so I thank you again, WECAN, so very much, and so very grateful to be in community with the collaborators of the Oklahina Ikisholo. We're both urban and rural, and you can learn more about our network at ohih.net. And with that, I will pass it back to you, Osprey. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Monique. So inspiring to see these beautiful images, and to hear all the different stories that you shared. And WECAN is really honored to have Monique be our food sovereignty coordinator in the Gulf South, and you can see why. She's an amazing leader, conducting. She has her fingers in a lot of pies, put it that way. She's very well networked in the area. And I wanted to thank you, Monique, for also pointing out, part of the global transformation of our economy is around localizing and honoring this Indigenous knowledge, and building out, as you said, autonomy. Certainly, we want to support Indigenous sovereignty, of course, but I also love that you brought in the fact of, how do we get autonomous to have our own power and our own sustainability, I think is really critical. And one of the visions that WECAN is, we are really working as partners with different communities in different regions of the world to grow food, to have food security and sovereignty, to have local energy sources, to be able to have local medicines. Because in the times that are coming, I think this is also really key, that people have that opportunity and resource to care for their own communities, while we're also fighting out at this global scale, how we're going to have a more just economic system, and also power down over consumerism, and all these things that we know need to happen to really respect nature and respect frontline communities. So, it's just beautiful to see what we can do at a local level, because I think it's also really inspiring, while these other pieces are also very important to advocate and fight for. So thank you so much, Monique. And now I'm going to hand the floor to Monica Gwalinga. And before you start, Monica, I just want to remind folks who are tuned in to go to, if you're not a Spanish speaker, to go to the interpretation globe and press English, so we can make sure we can hear from Monica. Please go ahead, Monica, you have the floor. Thank you.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Gracias por la invitación. Y realmente es un desafío poder hablar el tema del summa causa versus una transición justa, pero intentaré aproximar. Mi nombre es Mónica Chuji Gwalinga. Efectivamente, yo vengo de la Amazonía ecuatoriana, del norte, pertenezco a la comuna Sarayacu de Sucumbío, soy parte de la organización Fonaquise, y es precisamente una región en la Amazonía ecuatoriana donde por más de 50 años se ha explotado los hidrocarburos, y hasta el día de hoy se vive con la quema del aceite, el gas, y que hay una contaminación. Sin embargo, también es una región en donde los espacios territoriales de los pueblos indígenas son los que se mantienen con bosque. Entonces, hablaré a partir de ahí y un tema que en los últimos años ha venido tomando mucha fuerza, que es el summa causa, una propuesta filosófica y política de los pueblos indígenas. En efecto, en América Latina previamente debo decir que cada vez más se profundiza la economía extractivista, se profundiza el consumo incluso del agua dulce, cada vez más se profundiza las políticas que van en torno a poder implica que los territorios indígenas estén cada vez más amenazados por estas políticas, en donde la extracción de los hidrocarburos y de la minería es pues el objetivo final. Frente a esto, hay una propuesta que ha surgido en la década de los 90 y que lo surge precisamente en Ecuador, en la Amazonía ecuatoriana, y que es plasmado por los hermanos Alfredo y Leonardo Viteri, que quienes son los que teorizan una práctica de vida, una práctica y una forma de actuar y ser de los pueblos indígenas. Es decir, el summa causa y es una propuesta filosófica, es una propuesta política de los pueblos indígenas. Es la práctica, es la teoría de cómo se debe vivir, que surge de la práctica de la vida misma de los pueblos. El summa causa se basa en el cuidado de todas las vidas, porque partimos del saber y del sentir de que en la naturaleza todo lo que nos rodea, tiene vida y está en constante movimiento, y nosotros estamos en una constante interdependencia, interconexión con todo lo que nos rodea. Por tanto, la propuesta filosófica y política del summa causa se debe entender, además, en el contexto del ejercicio de la autodeterminación de los pueblos. El buen vivir es una traducción que se ha hecho al summa causa, pero no es lo mismo. El buen vivir es una propuesta más, pero que difiere del summa causa. El summa causa es una propuesta que nace, como digo, de la práctica y del pensamiento de los pueblos indígenas. Y veamos qué significa. Son dos palabras en idioma quichua con un profundo significado. Sumac significa hermoso, significa bonito, y causa y significa vida. Entonces, si lo unimos a las dos palabras, sería una vida hermosa, una vida plena, ¿verdad? Este concepto nace como una forma de contrarrestar al concepto del desarrollo, porque pues el desarrollo, como ya bien lo han dicho nuestras hermanas que me antecedieron la palabra, propone dominar y explotar a la naturaleza, mientras que el summa causa propone una filosofía distinta de relación con nuestra madre naturaleza. Entonces, para los pueblos indígenas, el summa causa implica y tiene que ver con mantener un bosque sano, una tierra sana, un agua limpia, ¿no? En tener salud y en tener también una relación armónica y una convivencia armónica con la familia, con el ayllu, con la colectividad, con la reciprocidad, con el respeto, con el no mentir, con el no robar, y con ese respeto constante a la madre naturaleza, y que además está atravesado con nuestra relación intrínseca con la espiritualidad que tenemos. El pensamiento del summa causa está profundamente relacionada, está profundamente conectada con el cuidar la selva, los bosques, los ríos, las montañas, los mares, con todos las diferentes biomas que existe en nuestro planeta. Mientras que el modelo de desarrollo, pues como ya lo han dicho también, se basa en el egoísmo, en la competencia, en una constante lucha entre los seres humanos, entre las empresas, le da más valor al capital, impulsa el crecimiento económico y la acumulación. El summa causa y apuesta por el sentir, por el pensar, por esa relación, por el cuidado, antes que en los cálculos matemáticos, en esos cálculos de acumulación. Evidentemente, la diferencia es abismal, como podemos ver. Sabemos también que la destrucción del planeta a causa del desarrollismo trae consecuencias impredecibles. Una de sus consecuencias es el cambio climático. Creo que esta consecuencia se basa en estas ambiciones económicas desproporcionadas y de una racionalidad sustentada en aquello de controlar y dominar la naturaleza, que se ancla precisamente en la filosofía y en la política del neoliberalismo y del capitalismo y de la acumulación. Por tanto, este control de la naturaleza está desatando unos desastres que amenazan a la humanidad entera, y asimismo están dando señales sobre la necesidad de valorar otros pensamientos, otras propuestas de vida y otras prácticas de vida. Y por eso, en este caso, pues, el summa causa que acabo de mencionarles. Ahora bien, lo estaba pensando y decía que es un desafío pensar esto de transformar las economías globales de la extracción a la regeneración en una transición justa. Y pensaba justamente qué es la transición justa, qué es lo que debe entenderse. Transición justa versus summa causa. Creo que son grandes temas que nos llevarían mucho tiempo de análisis. Sin embargo, he querido aproximar. Creo que la transición energética, que significa pasar de combustibles fósiles a energías renovables, tiene realmente varias implicaciones profundas. Las energías renovables dependen también de la minería metálica para fabricar los materiales que funcionan, porque ¿de dónde más se va a sacar si no es de la misma minería? Esto implica continuar explotando la minería a gran escala en los territorios indígenas, en zonas protegidas. Entonces, para que sea justa, tiene que pasar por tiene que haber un cambio de sistema definitivamente, pero al menos por puntualizar, quisiera recalcar lo siguiente. Yo creo que ante todo tiene que pasar por reconocer, por respetar y garantizar los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Creo que tiene que respetarse, reconocerse las normas internacionales como la Declaración de Naciones Unidas, el Convenio 169 de la OIT, y otras normas regionales como el Acuerdo de Escazú en el caso de América Latina. Y por supuesto, todas otras normas directrices que tienen que ver con el tema de las energías renovables y el tema de las extracciones. Creo que también hay que apuntar, hay que exigir que los estados y las empresas respeten las normas legales nacionales, es decir, las constituciones que rigen en nuestro país. Y por tanto también implica a que tienen que respetarse zonas intangibles que son declaradas por pueblos indígenas o por el mismo estado. Yo creo que algo fundamental, y creo que es la piedra angular de nuestros derechos, es precisamente reconocer el derecho a la autodeterminación de los pueblos indígenas y el derecho a la consulta y consentimiento libre, previo e informado. Creo que este es uno de los aspectos fundamentales que se requiere que se respeten. Otro aspecto fundamental me parece que se debe proporcionar financiación directa y adecuada para las comunidades indígenas, para los pueblos indígenas. Creo que es necesario que haya un apoyo técnico, un apoyo jurídico, potenciar las capacidades de los pueblos indígenas, de las comunidades, para que puedan tener las herramientas necesarias y poder a los actores externos. Creo que es importante que los estados y las empresas deben promover la erradicación de materiales de un solo uso que contaminan el planeta y promover el uso de materiales sostenibles. Creo que hay mucha materia y mucha teoría al respecto. Sabemos que eso no se ha tomado en serio definitivamente, y las empresas siguen produciendo materiales de un solo consumo, de modo que esto va contaminando los espacios de vida. Yo creo que otro aspecto fundamental, además, es que deben dejar de criminalizar, perseguir, asesinar, encarcelar a los pueblos indígenas y a los no indígenas que defienden la naturaleza, porque este trabajo, la defensa de los espacios de vida en el planeta, está en realidad, se está haciendo el trabajo que deberían hacer los estados, las empresas y toda la sociedad. Sin embargo, es como que se le ha dado la responsabilidad como a los pueblos indígenas hacer este trabajo de la defensa. Creo que también implica que el summa causa nos desafía a cambiar un sistema de vida, a cambiar los hábitos de consumo, nos desafía que todos debemos hacernos cargo desde nuestras propias actuaciones a cuidar el medio ambiente y a cuidar nuestro planeta. Creo que nos desafía a reforestar nuestro planeta. Me parece fundamental que además en esta era hay una emergencia del apoyo y una necesidad de fomentar, potenciar las iniciativas locales, familiares, comunitarias que promuevan la soberanía y la seguridad alimentaria. La regeneración de los territorios donde haya monocultivo, creo que es una de las prácticas que puede promover, que puede ayudar a la resiliencia. Creo que el summa causa y reta a la sociedad fundamentalmente a reconectarnos con nuestra madre tierra, con nuestra madre naturaleza, con nuestra Pachamama, porque esa conexión en algún momento de la historia se rompió en Occidente, se rompió y que ha permitido mirar con otros ojos a la naturaleza, que ahora lo miran como un objeto a ser explotado, a dominarlo y a sacar de ella todos los recursos, mientras que nosotros tenemos definitivamente otra mirada. Y finalmente, creo que hay un gran desafío que es sensibilizar a la sociedad global. La sensibilidad tiene que pasar y es una responsabilidad de todas y todos, porque de lo contrario, lo que vamos a seguir teniendo esos espacios muy válidos, pero sin embargo necesitamos masificar esta sensibilización, promover esta reconexión de la sociedad con nuestra madre naturaleza. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Monica, for that very comprehensive and powerful presentation and the wisdom that you're sharing from Indigenous peoples on Indigenous economy. I really love hearing about Sumak Kausai. And when I have been in Ecuador, so many mentors there have shared these concepts with me and how powerful they are. And as you say, it's really about transforming ourselves in relationship to Mother Earth. As you said, it's a very deep philosophy and worldview and understanding. So I wanted to thank you for sharing that with us. And I often think about how we have this very extractive economy that we've been talking about with a certain value system of over-consumerism and more and more and more, and how our modern society is based upon this. And the huge difference of having a system like Sumak Kausai, where everything is in relationship for the well-being of the community, for the earth, and it's very holistic. And how do we actually get from here to over there is this complicated space that so many of us are trying to navigate so that there is justice and that we can, come back home to some of these localized, beautiful ways of understanding living in harmony with nature and each other that so often come from Indigenous people. So I really thank you for that presentation, and also to say that we stand with you and continue to stand with you in solidarity around a lot of these struggles of mining and fossil fuel extraction in your territories. 80% of the biodiversity left on Earth is in Indigenous territories. And it's because of things like Sumak Kausai and the knowledge of Indigenous peoples that the last of the forests and the waters and that biodiversity of the plant animal species is in Indigenous lands or stewardship. So this is no small matter to realize that part of the analysis at this moment is Indigenous rights and respecting free, prior, and informed consent. It's part of this nexus and this ecosystem of moving to a new economy has a lot to do with respecting Indigenous rights and territories. So I'll leave it at that, but I really appreciate you joining us and bringing this knowledge, because it's absolutely critical for this moment of transformation. Thank you. And with that, I'd like to invite Helena Norberg Hodge to please take the floor. We're so honored to have you be with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Very happy to be here. And I had my eyes open to these issues by entering an indigenous culture called Ladakh, or Little Tibet, in 1975, when it was first thrown open to the outside world. And I had the great privilege of ending up staying there. I was planning to only be there for 6 weeks to help make a film, but I learned to speak the language fluently and fell in love with people who were the most radiantly happy of any people I'd ever encountered. They were also the healthiest people. There was no poverty. There was no unemployment. Unemployment never existed before the modern economy. And in living there and then seeing this area thrown open to the outside world, I not only got a very deep lesson in the indigenous localized economies and how they operated, but also I came to understand that the global economic system, which entered these local economies with artificially low prices, I came to understand that we are living in a world where big is subsidized and the small are heavily taxed and regulated. Global corporations have no rules. They are signing agreements with our governments that say, if you do anything to impede our profit, we will take you to court. Now sign this piece of paper and say you agree. Governments from America to my native country of Sweden, to every country I know of, are signing agreements with global banks and corporations that we won't do anything that will reduce your profit. Now, where does this come from? I think it's really helpful to understand that the global economic system started with enclosures and slavery. What was happening was that global traders who were in Europe, they were white men, they were racist, they were misogynist, they had very explicit anti-nature values, and they managed to trade in slaves and in Europe to drive people off the land, destroying self-reliance, destroying any form of indigeneity in what has become so-called rich countries. From my experiences, we've got to completely rethink rich and poor. We've got to be very careful of the SDGs. We've got to be very careful about language now of investment, debt. Microcredit has been a way of destroying rural, self-reliant communities, creating debt where there wasn't debt before. We have to remember that when you're invested in from the outside, whether it's in Sweden or in any country in Africa, you're actually being subjected to money coming in that wants to take more money out. So I believe that a basic ABC in understanding this global economic system from the bottom up, starting with the enclosures and slavery, also realizing that these Western traders had been trading before dramatic enclosures and before the trade in slaves, and that with the help of Christianity, they had conquered indigenous peoples with the worldview that they were inferior and that Christianity, this one monolithic top-down system, was superior. They had burnt women at the stake who in the Western world had been carriers of a truly universal spirituality, of earth-based, indigenous, feminine spirituality that was place-based, that was localized. Indigenous was always localized, even when people moved around. It was in a particular area. They developed knowledge about those plants, about those animals, about that water. And they knew that they were one and the same. They knew, they experienced the interconnectedness of life. After I had lived in Ladakh for a few years and I went back to Sweden, I suddenly understood why I had suffered from depression, why there was an epidemic of depression in Sweden already in the 70s. We were a country that was held up as this great example of successful, just industrial modernity. But people had been driven off the land. They were living in high-rise apartments. There was not only depression, but suicide, alcoholism. And I saw that literally in many apartments where one person was living alone, there was nothing alive. plastic plants, windows that didn't open. And so it became very clear to me already almost 50 years ago that reconnection to nature and reconnection to community is the way home for all of us. And I wrote a book called Ancient Futures with the message that we need to learn from indigenous cultures, and we need to learn from the structures of how they live. We need to realize that we never would have evolved. There would have been no evolution if we had not lived in interdependent, intergenerational, collaborative communities. We evolved because we collaborated. We evolved because we had deep knowledge of, as I say, the plants, the animals, the trees that we were interdependent with. So both the human interdependence and the interdependence with nature was a fundamental part of it. So seeing how the modern economy as a knife cuts through relationships, separates us further and further from one another, from nature, and from ourselves. We know now about the social dilemma. We know that the algorithms in this machine-like global economy know that more hatred, more polarization, more violence extracts wealth to the top. We know that in this top, we have essentially a corporate empire, interlinked, not evil people. I know a lot of them. I've met a lot of people that I do not approve of their ideas, but they are blind to the realities of life. They are blind to the diversity, the infinite change, the quantum nature of reality. So now I'm really happy to be talking to WECAN. I think I've always been supported primarily by women, but I've never been a feminist. But I'm now talking about ancient futures being local futures, being feminine futures. Around the world, the people who are transforming their communities and their local economies into something rich, into something truly productive, something truly just, something truly ecological. It's primarily led by women. However, I think that we all need to engage in a more ABC training on the economy. Whatever you do, don't study economics, but please come to our website at Local Futures, link up with the network that we've been building up around the world. It's a global network. It's both men and women, but we are all looking critically at the global economy and supporting a transition towards decentralization, greater localization. The paradox is that we need to collaborate globally in order to build up that collective that you're talking about in WECAN. Must collaborate, must have a strong united voice for a united no to one monolithic patriarchal system that was started by white men, yes, but it is no longer a white man's project. It is more a project of algorithms. And please remember, when you talk about shareholder profits, that so-called poor countries are just as implicated. The shareholders are now just as much from India, China, parts of Africa. So please, let's move away from any type of racism, any politics of identity, even away from gender. So I like to call it feminine futures. Let's work with those men who are willing to own their hearts, their compassionate, caring, respectful, responsive nature, to be willing to listen to the feminine approach, the earth-based approach, the approach that defends the infinite diversity, the infinite richness of the living world. Let's remember that we can say a very strong, powerful no to a top-down, man-made, literally man-made system that over the last few hundred years has imprisoned us in a worldview of separation and a world of separation and conflict. It's not only in the social media that empire now extracts money for violent conflict, but for war. The forever wars that are coming are because we're allowing a machine-like extractive global economy with global banks and corporations that pay no tax, have no rules. And in the meanwhile, every one of us suffers from bigger bureaucratic regulations, more tax, we're squeezed for time. The main thing that's happening is that in this imprisoned economy, human life, human labor is too expensive for us. We're being subjected to these hidden subsidies that mean that every price in the marketplace is fake. So goods that have been transported around the world cost less than something from a mile away. And when it comes to food, we're talking about the single most important economic activity, how we produce our food, and that this food is now, as part of a global system, the most polluting, the most destructive system of all. So transforming and building up local food economies is one of the most important things we can do. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that great presentation, Helena. And, I wanted just to mention that, I think it's really important, and we really try to do this at WECAN, and we're in touch with many colleagues from around the world, that that we look in the very short term what needs to happen, because people are suffering right now due to this extractive economy. People on the front lines, as we heard from Monica, right now that are under attack from industry and mining corporations. And so there's one angle of really understanding that there is an urgent need to stand with the front lines in this moment of transition. And at the same time, we also need to have this long view and this other attention, which also, I think, Helen, you're bringing us our attention to, which is something also that we really look at WECAN, is that we do a deep analysis on the historical oppression that has got us to this moment, because it's sort of like if you go to the doctor, if you don't get a diagnosis, it's really hard to treat and get healthy. And so I think there needs to be space for this very deep analysis of where did capitalism come from? Where did slavery come from? Where is the root of colonization? What is the root of racism? And so those deep dives are extremely necessary, because if we're going to build a healthy and equitable world going forward, we need the proper diagnosis about supremacy, about all of these issues that are at the root of the worldviews that are what we're living in right now, that are leading to so much harm and destruction and suffering and pain for people all over the world. And so I just wanted to highlight to people that this is a very wide-ranging conversation, which we wanted so that we could look at immediate concerns, immediate urgent matters, look at solutions that people are doing already on the ground, and also understand that there's a need to have a much deeper analysis so that we can really unwind this in a way that actually meets the depth of the transformation that's needed. And not everyone has to enter all of these different spaces. It's an ecosystem of activities of how to approach transforming the world economy. And so I just wanted to frame that, this wide-ranging conversation is on purpose so that we can really look at this from different angles, because it is exactly where we are in this moment that is very complex, and how we can take it apart in different bite-sized pieces, so to speak, to understand different components of the transformation. Now, last and not least, we have Zukiswa White, who I'm very excited because we get to work with Zukiswa at the Women and Gender constituency, which is a very important constituency that is part of the United Nations climate talks that go on every year. And so I wanted to bring that into the conversation, because this is a space where we can intervene with world governments, which is also part of how we're going to achieve a just transition and move forward. And with that, Zukiswa, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, colleagues. Is my audio okay? Yeah? Lovely.
Everything's great.
Nice. Thank you so much to, this lively and, important discussion, of course, to WECAN for the invite. As Osprey has mentioned, I work to support coordination of the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change, which is essentially the multilateral space where decision makers in particular parties, meet every single year to decide and define on our collective future and survival. Like many multilateral spaces, those who we know are harmed by the decisions or inactions that often come out of these processes are locked out of very critical conversations and, evidence-based decision-making. And so it's really important that civil society continues to claim their space, particularly feminist civil society, particularly civil society representing Indigenous communities, because the reality is that what happens in those closed doors, we know who is the ones who are facing the brunt of this. So while they come in their private jets to come talk for 2 weeks and, discuss where to put a comma in a policy, we know that real lives are at stake. And so the pressures that continue to build as a result of consolidated efforts to ensure that, the UN, which is increasingly becoming unfit for purpose across the board, we are seeing a genocide happen right in front of our eyes, and we are seeing mechanisms within the multilateral process like the Security Council fail to deliver on what should be their mandate. And so I am encouraging all of us that while these processes might seem, so redundant and, so frustrating, we cannot allow for the continued capturing of these spaces that are meant to provide a collaborative spaces for states to come together and contribute meaningfully to maintaining peace, security, and well-being remains unencumbered. And so I'm very proud of the work that feminists and women's rights organizations keep doing to insist on our voice and our space and our perspectives in these spaces so that it does not continue business as usual, particularly at the cost of, taxpayers' money, which is money that we know because of austerity and other measures is taken away from such critical life-saving social services. And so while these processes are going to be going on, it is our fight as well to ensure that they remain fit for purpose. And the UNFCCC is one area where the women and gender constituency particularly is really fighting big fights to ensure that their mandate to deliver on climate justice is a mandate that they take seriously and is a mandate that they respect. Now, I wanted to start very quickly with a scenario, right? And this is really, we are told more than we are not told. And this is, because of who is able to fund the media, who's able to ensure whose perspectives are more visible. We hear all sorts of excuses of why transitioning from, economic models of harm to care is impossible. We keep being reminded of how our development depends on it, how, the demands that Indigenous people are making, feminists and women's rights are making, the Global South is making, are impossible. Even in basic conversations, for instance, around climate finance, who should be funding these transitions, economies who have literally built their backs, who get to call themselves developed today, who have, because of the exploitation of the Global South and Indigenous communities, want to tell us that what we are asking for is impossible, while they continue to have, laws that ensures that one CEO from one company earns, more than 1,000 working class people in a day. You know what I'm saying? So I want us to imagine a situation where we think about, I grew up in a time where in Azania, erroneously referred to as South Africa, something like a color TV when I was growing up was not something that all homes had. It was still very fascinating when I was growing up. Cartoons were very fascinating. And now, 30 years later, I have a phone I have a TV with color on my phone. Where am I going with that? I can imagine that my 7-year-old niece would almost not even be able to imagine a life outside of smartphones, outside of color TVs. I mean, if I had to tell my niece, and I'm not very old, that, in my day, we never used to have this and this, I think they would struggle to understand, what I'm talking about. Why does this matter? I think the idea that we also need to challenge is that social progress or development needs to follow a particular process and timeline for all people everywhere all the time. When kids are born in this new era, their first interaction with a telephone is not the thing that we use where you turn it around and dial 0, then dial 1. They immediately access a cell phone, right? We don't have to tell them that, this is what you must use first, and then you use a phone that doesn't have, color, and then you use a smartphone. They immediately jump to smartphones. And there must be something to be said about how, for transitioning conversations, everyone keeps raising the redundant argument of development. Why do we need to develop economies from, fossil fuel-based economic models when we know what fossil fuel economic models of development have meant? Why are we allowing governments and decision makers to lie to us and tell us that we cannot see a future of prosperity, of collective, collective development, if I can use that word? I have a problem with it, but collective prosperity and development outside of, using these particular steps. Just because how the United States of America, for example, was built was due to very harmful institutions, slavery included, for example, as well as, the development of this industry, which has caused these emissions, does not mean that for countries to thrive, we all have to follow the same paths. The same way that today, we used to have these cell phones, and how we used to communicate was so complicated. And today I just pick up my phone and I join a conversation virtually. Why are we insisting that capitalists and imperialists capture our imaginations by lying to us, making us believe that there is no alternative pathways to ensuring a future of prosperity for all? It is simply not true. Now, excuse me, I want to be on time, so I want to follow these notes very closely. So transition does not have to be a narrative that we continue to accept is impossible or difficult or et cetera, We know all across through history, there's been examples of how, you need one big decision or shift to happen and the rest will follow. I come from a continent that was colonized, by European superpowers. If it took the first African country 70 years to decolonize from a political perspective, did it take the second country 70 years? No. Things followed suit. It was like a couple of countries after that first one showed what is possible that inspired a whole generation of African leaders to ensure that their countries also follow suit. What am I affirming again? We do not need to buy into the lie that what we are calling for, the radical futures we want, are going to take so many are so impossible in scope that it's simply not possible. We have brought down throughout human histories institutions that are way older than a global imperial capitalism. We went from a time where the divine right of kings to rule was something that was socially accepted. And now almost all the world, we know that, there's a process called democracy where, people are voted into, and kings and queens are something we just see as figureheads. We've seen institutions of chattel slavery be taken down by the people. So even history has an example of how seemingly impossible institutionalized way and forms of life were toppled down by the people and the people alone. All of the progress that we see in society today, all of the harm that we've managed to push back in society today is a result of the people insisting that another way is always possible. And we are living proof even today of how that is true. The indigenous people of the Americas, for example, should have long been wiped out, and that was the vision of the colonizer. But we are seeing indigenous people resist and insist on their claim to their lands and their claims to live even today. So as I wrap up, I have more to say. But I think the fossil fuel industry is facing increasing resistance by communities. These are not the stories that the media will report en masse, right? There was a time where fossil fuel companies could go into a community, promise them, milk and honey under the guise of jobs, under the guise of development, under the guise of ending hunger, and they would continue with their projects. We are seeing today how communities are actually questioning, why must this model of development include harming our natural way of life, harming our lands, our ancestral lands, our ways of being? So the fossil fuel industry is in fact facing a lot of resistance that nobody's going to want us to know about, because it serves their interest, them wanting us to believe that we are losing when in fact we are not. And so communities are refusing the lie that the disregard for nature and development is a path to prosperity. Even when you ask communities in rural Azania or South Africa that, they are poor, therefore they need Shell to come and, develop a pipeline, they'll ask you, poor according to who? How do you define what poverty is? Because where we stand, we are able to feed our children, we are able to farm our food, and so we do not consider ourselves as poor. You want to continue with the lie that we are poor, and the only way for us to not be poor is to get XYZ. And so even the white supremacist imperial model of what development looks like and means is increasingly being challenged, and I think we need to take note of that. What do we know that's happening? As I wrap up, communities led by local women are pursuing locally led and responsive solutions to the climate crisis. What are their barriers? Nobody wants to fund them. Nobody wants us to know that these exist, especially because these climate solutions, which are often gender and socially just, are also offering a new model for how we understand, innovation and who gets to own it, who gets to collectively govern. And there's several examples. Young people are showing us that they are refusing to let go of their futures. They are refusing to undermine the integrity of the planet. And so as I wrap up, because of time I just want to make 4 points that the key challenges that we need, that we are facing and we must respond to is, number one, the capturing of our imagination by the imperialist, global, capitalist, white supremacist logic. We are not winning, we are not losing. What we are wanting is not impossible, and we need to make sure that we insist on that imagination and we take forward the fight that we are fighting. Secondly, global institutions and funding mechanisms are trapping the global south into debt, right? That they're making us take these loans, which could be used for more socially beneficial initiatives in country. And then they are also insisting that we don't have the capacity to respond to the crisis, yet they are ensuring we actually cannot. And wealthy countries, built off our backs, are stalling on their responsibility under the convention to, own up and ensure we move there. What do? Insist on the imagination, fight like hell to win because we are not losing, and also support the efforts of global civil society around the world to pursue the objectives of alternative pathways and really insist that not only are these possible, but we will realize them in this lifetime. Thank you so much for the time, and over to you, Osprey.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Zukiswa, for that very powerful and really very, very important presentation. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to make a few points. We are going to need to close, or we're over time, so we're going to need to close soon. But I just wanted to say, that I think it is very, very important that we are sort of in the emperor's not wearing clothes moment, and we all need to remember really that we have power, as Zukiswa was saying, and can really step in with our own thinking about what should happen and how we should be living in our communities and with the earth. And I also want to point out the struggle that it is, because, as we do gain power and we are seeing land back moves, we are seeing moves towards many, many developments of things like beyond growth, degrowth models. How do we move out of GDP as our value system and our indicators for countries? there is pushback. We have to understand we are going to collectively need to support each other more than ever. We've seen in the last year civic space decrease. We're seeing the criminalization of land defenders increase, or even going to a protest against a bank for doing a harmful project or violating Indigenous or human rights. The level of arrests and what is being charged is increasing. So I just also want to point out that we're hitting, one of the hot wires of the supremacist, colonized, white supremacy, imperialistic world that we live within. And I just want to say that, we need to do this in a loving and caring way, but also understand we're going right into the belly of the beast here. Because as long as we stay away from the economy and the wealthy get to continue and they get to have their wars and they get to continue, then there can be little projects and little things helped with, but not actually getting to the root cause of the transformation we need. So this is something that is an ongoing dialogue and something, that we want to support our networks in, because we will need to be together to go up against those forces, because they're very, very real. And to understand, just look at the billions of dollars that have gone into the recent wars. Look at the billions that are going there. The money is there. The money is there. But we need this different feminist perspective, Indigenous knowledge, this other knowledge to have the money move away from harm and into sumak kausai and these different models of living, of localized living, and the way that we all want to be with our families on the land, close to nature, being cared for, not worrying about our food or shelter. So this is part of what women and feminists are bringing to the table, is we want those billions going somewhere else, and we want it now. It can't wait, and we have the right to have this change. And this has to do with deep values that have to change, and this is really at the core of it. And we need to do it at every level of government, financial institutions, at local levels, and in many ways, this is our work. We must do it. We really have no other choice. We must do this. We must do this for our families. We must do this for the plants and animals. We must do this for nature. We must do this for our communities. This has been a really powerful conversation. I really want to thank everyone for their participation, the panelists for your extraordinary knowledge and presentations. We did go over time, so we're going to need to close at this point, but I really appreciate everyone who tuned in to listen to the webinar. We're going to be sharing this on our social media. We also have all the links that we'll be sharing so people can learn more about this work. But I love that we're having this discussion. It's hard. It's a hard discussion because so much needs to happen in this space. But I think we went a good way today. We walked together on a good path today, and a lot was opened up. Thank you all so much. And we're going to go ahead and close out. Thank you, everybody.